Well, directing a play isn't all about looking at the script and then pointing and waving your hands around, but it can't hurt. Hi there, my name is Craig Johnson, and for more than 40 years, I've been working as an actor and a director, and sometimes as a teacher and producer and writer in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. And I came across an old PowerPoint. Oh, take a look at that cute little square formatting right there, all about directing for the theater. And so I thought I would dust that off just a little bit and share it with you. A little bit of history, some thoughts, and then some stories to illustrate it. Well, even though I've been working for a long time in theater and I've done a number of productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, this is not my show. This is from the late 19th century and is a great illustration, I think, of the way that Shakespeare was done at that time period. Very opulent, taking advantage of all the wonderful scenic effects that they were able to do and populating the entire stage with all kinds of extras. And look at that, they're just fairies everywhere. And you can tell because, look, they seem to be in a little bit of that gossamer and tulle, and they all have angel wings on them. And this tradition of doing Shakespeare and doing Midsummer Night's Dream in this manner continued for many decades after that. So even in the late 1930s, Tyrone Guthrie would direct a production at the Old Vic in London with Ralph Richardson, Vivian Leigh, and Robert Helpman. And there they would be, again, all gussied up in the same kind of manner. Well, after a number of years, this guy came along and said, enough's enough. We have to free Shakespeare from these overstuffed, overproduced traditions and see if we can mint the play anew and discover what it is in a way that would be meaningful and relevant in the modern age. And to that end, he and his set designer and entire team created the production that was done for the Royal Shakespeare Company and premiered in 1970. This is the famous white box production where magical characters could walk around on the top and observe action and get involved in it. The entire look of the show had this very stark, streamlined, minimalist kind of quality with these brilliant splashes of saturated color. Characters went up and down, and there were a lot of techniques from theater artistry that were employed throughout the entire production. When the successful run ran its course at the RSC, it then went on a world tour. And believe it or not, in 1972, when I was 11 or 12 years old, I saw it in Tokyo, Japan, where my family was living at the time. We went on a school field trip, and it was a wonderful production. I can still remember so many moments from that show that were just hilarious and breathtaking, and it just seemed to whip right by. And it was one of the things that sparked my interest in theater. Well, I guess you could say it's been all downhill since there. No, not really. And even today, when we think about doing A Midsummer Night's Dream, we are so influenced by the work that Peter Brook did for that production at the RSC in 1970. We can see so many production images today that use that sense of light and dark, of saturated color, and the playful surrealism throughout. That last slide, the vertical one right there with the silks, is the last production of, I think, about 6 Midsummer Night's Dreams that I have done. So it's just really a testament to what one director, Peter Brook, was able to do to liberate theater. And we go from generation, building upon it until someone comes along and tries something absolutely new. Well, let's take a look at theater in the past and find out where this idea of this director first sprang up. Now, the standard line kind of in the history of directing is, oh, directors have only been around for about 140 years. Is that true or false? Well, maybe a better answer might be, it's true and false. And this is what I mean by that. There has always been someone, presumably, who was in charge of a production happening, but exactly what that person was called, or persons, and who did that may have changed over in different eras and different styles of theater. If we go back to the golden age of Greek theater, we're thinking 5th century BCE in Athens, we do know that the playwright often served as the didaskalos, or the teacher for the production. Well, that sounds kind of like a director, and that person might also be an actor in it. Oh, well, look there. There's Tyrone Guthrie once again talking to one of his actors in the elaborate costumes for the House of Atreus that the Guthrie did in the late 1960s, I believe, and then took to Broadway. There is also in ancient Greek theater, the choregus. Now, sometimes that's translated as the head of the chorus, so people end up thinking, oh, well, that would be like the choreographer, or the person who was in charge of the music and the movement in that part of an ancient Greek production. But it seems more likely that that person was the producer, the person who organized all the different people and the elements of the show and provided the money for it. But those are a couple people that were involved in that. If we jump forward a millennia or two to the medieval theater, well, this was a time period when people just loved their religious plays. Mystery plays, miracle, and morality plays were the center of the theatrical universe at that time. And there was an intense focus on the spectacle, so much so that I kind of wonder what kind of ethical or moral teachings came out of some of those shows, because it looks like sort of all the evil people and those fire-breathing dragons and devils might be having the most amount of fun. Anyway, so elaborate were these kind of shows, whether they were performed on individual stages, mansions, or whether they were on wagons that rolled around and found their audience that way. There were a couple people who have been identified as the leaders of the production, and they were often called, not surprising, the pageant masters or the conductors of secrets. And given all their special effects, that seems appropriate. If we take a look at larger global theater, classical theater, we can see that there's a strong tradition in learning and passing on the skills and techniques from generation to generation. And that might account for a number of the sort of things that we would associate nowadays with a director. For example, in the ancient Sanskrit theater, which is about 2 millennia old, in India, there are elaborate techniques for training younger performers to learn all of the different gestures, really right down to finger placement, to use of the eyebrows and rolling the eyes in a really remarkably rich and detailed tradition. The same could be said of Noh theater in Japan, which started around the 14th century, I believe, which is very stripped down and stylized, always with this same kind of setting, and often a very slow-moving narrative that has this almost hypnotic or kind of mesmerizing effect to it, with really very regulated and codified character choices, movements, and all of the other elements of that. So it's another one. I believe there's a saying in Noh theater with like, above all, change nothing. So that importance of passing down from generation to generation exactly how these shows should be done is a big part of that tradition. And if we jump over to Italy, during the Renaissance, there's, on the other hand, a very wild and raucous street theater, traveling players who would be performing the Commedia dell'arte. And this kind of theater had, again, a bunch of very broad character types, and an actor would specialize in probably one of those and hone it over the years and play it for a very long time, perhaps their whole career. And they would create a whole bunch of different kind of comic shtick, physical comedy, that they could use and insert into many, many of the different plays. But even saying plays is a bit of a misnomer, because the shows were largely improvised. They had set storylines that everyone knew, but individual performers could improvise as they went along and change it from performance to performance. So it seems just like a wonderfully crazy and wacky way of having complete freedom with improvisation to go in whatever direction you want, but then having this very polished, refined kind of character choices that you could insert, and you could do your little specialty act in whatever show it might be. There was a lot of multitasking in traditional theater too. We do know that for hundreds of years, there were many leading actors who might also be the authors of some of the plays, and they also helped run the theater. So they had that management or producer aspect to them. We do know that both Shakespeare and Moliere in England and in France were not only actors, but of course, the major writers for their troupe, and they also helped lead the theater companies that they were part of. This continued in England through famous people like David Garrick in the 18th century, Henry Irving in the 19th century, and the same too for Edwin Booth in the United States. And this idea of an actor also directing a production continued well into the 20th century, and great British stars like John Gielgud and Sir Laurence Olivier, Sir John Gielgud and Lord Olivier, there we go, both acted in and directed productions that they were a part of, which seems exhausting and impossible. If you've ever tried to do it, don't. So in the late 19th century, there were a number of changes that were taking place in society that kind of led us to the development of the director as a sole outside figure in how theater gets made. And if you do any kind of theater history, you're going to run across a various group of names of people who were instrumental in that particular change at that time period at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. I just happen to have chosen 4, but these are 4 that appear in a lot of people's lists. The first that we have to acknowledge is our friend Georg II and his beard. Let's face it. As a duke, he, of course, had a lot of resources to do whatever he wanted. And what he really wanted to do was make theater better. He thought it was not very good as he looked around. And so he established his own court theater and started doing exactly what directors do today. He instituted a very intensive rehearsal process. Everyone had to come to play practice. And that helped unify the acting ensemble. So rather than have one grand histrionic star and some supernumeraries who were just sort of standing around, he lifted the level and brought together the level of the entire acting ensemble. His production values were of a very high order. As opposed to earlier shows, he started creating things that were historically accurate, and he coordinated all of the different elements so that they blended together into a harmonious whole. He was said to be particularly effective at pictorial effects on stage and moving people around in a really graceful and beautiful manner, and was very effective with large crowd scenes, getting people on and off stage. In addition to classics, he did a number of the newer writers like Henrik Ibsen, but probably the most important thing he did outside of creating these shows is he let people see them by taking his troupe on tour for a 16-year period. And you know what happens when the exciting new thing kind of comes to town, especially in theater. Well, all those people who are really big theater supporters and love theater, well, they want to go check it out and see what it's all about. All of the theater makers in town are interested in what is this new thing and what is this new competition that's on my doorstep. And all the people who write about theater and cover it do exactly that. And that's exactly what happened. When all these people saw that, they realized there is no going back. So to Georg II, we doff our caps and say, he's the person who really demonstrated that value of having a single vision that would coordinate and unify an entire production. Now let's jump over to Russia. Here's probably a familiar name. Constantine Stanislavski was a brilliant character actor at the time. He too was despairing about the shoddy state of theater at that time period. So he formed, along with a number of other very brilliant people, the Moscow Art Theater. And he found in Anton Chekhov the ideal playwright to explore this detailed emotional and psychological realism that he was seeking in acting. But he was not only a great actor and a great director, he was also an author and a teacher of acting, and his books have remained in circulation decade after decade and have influenced many other actors and teachers, so much so that you can kind of draw a line from Stanislavski's work at the turn of the century in Russia through to the American realism acting like the actor's studio and method acting in the mid 20th century that was popularized by really great film actors like Marlon Brando, Paul Newman, Maureen Stapleton, Marilyn Monroe, Joanne Woodward, and so many others. On the more experimental front, there was a fellow, André Antoine, in Paris, who really wanted to look at new, different kinds of scripts and really push home a very detailed realism in his physical production. The stories that I love are the play that took place in a slaughterhouse, and there were huge sides of beef actual sides of beef that hung there. And I kept thinking, oh, better not go later in the run for that too. Whew, pretty stinky. Maybe stinky as well too. There was a time where he needed to show a student's dorm room, a garret apartment for a student. So he actually brought this student's entire apartment and put that on stage. There's nothing like the exact real thing. And he matched that with some of the more experimental avant-garde writers of that time period too, and greatly influenced European art theater in that way. And the last one is a fellow I kind of like called Edward Gordon Craig, who may not have been a very pleasant person, but I think he was very influential on how theater evolved, up to and including some of the things that Peter Brook was playing around with in that production of A Midsummer Night's Dream that I started with. Just a little detail on Edward Gordon Craig's beginnings. One of the biggest stars of Victorian theater was Sir Henry Irving. His leading lady was Ellen Terry. Ellen Terry had a child out of wedlock, not with Henry Irving, with someone else. And that little baby grew up to be our hero of the moment, Edward Gordon Craig. And so he was part of a very large, sprawling theatrical family. And as I was saying, a lot of times you end up having theater built generation by generation and influencing one another as time goes on. And that was the case with this particular theatrical family. Ellen Terry's great nephew and Edward Gordon Craig's nephew was Sir John Gielgud, who we already mentioned, who was one of the great stars of 20th century British theater. Anyway, Edward Gordon Craig and his work was largely as a designer, director, and theorist. He didn't have a lot of big hit shows. He was somewhat difficult to work with. Actors didn't like him that much because he treated them often like uber marionettes. So there wasn't the kind of emotional, psychological, physical freedom that they have. They were much more controlled. But what he did bring to the party was a sense of a very unified and abstract designs using color, shape, light, and darkness in a way that somewhat emulated the changes that the visual arts, painting, cubism, abstract painting, and things like that were going through at the same time. And so from that, you can really see a little bit of similarity, as I said, from his work to the work of later directors like Peter Brook. So the question might arise, well, okay, well then why did all of this happen? Why were there suddenly modern directors as a separate entity in theater? Why did it happen at that particular time? And a lot of it had to do with technical advancements that, as I had said earlier, people in the Victorian theater, 19th century theater, really loved to play around with. Well, that meant that you need to have someone who is in charge of coordinating all that. And that especially came true as gas lighting and electric lighting developed, so that there could be someone sitting out front to say, we need more light, we need the light focused here, it needs to shift now. And so a lot of those technical elements of the theater as they sprang up really required another eye out front. So it couldn't be that same actor manager doing that. Even things like the development of photography greatly influenced what was going to happen on stage. And by that, I mean, beforehand, it was really a limited awareness that people would have in terms of the clothing and the scenery, the kind of environments that people in other places and especially at other times would have had. But with the development of photography, you could see photographs reproduced in books and magazines and other places that would show us the larger population, as well as the people who were making theater, exactly what things looked like in other areas and at different time periods as they were maybe photographing artworks. And so this sense of historic accuracy became a bigger issue when presenting plays in different times and different eras. And that was especially important because theater was probably at its zenith as a popular entertainment. So many people were going to see theater because of the Industrial Revolution. There were more people in cities doing office and factory jobs and wanting to have some kind of entertainment at night, so they might go out to the theater. And with this rising middle class meant there was a little more affluence. People could afford tickets. They were better educated, so they had seen some of those pictures and they had studied some of that literature. And there was also a transportation network, primarily rail, that connected people from town and country, and from country to country, and sometimes across the continent in Europe or North America. So not only could people get to places where theater was being performed, the theater could come to them through a vast network of touring productions that would crisscross various countries. So if we take as an example, people may have thought beforehand, oh, this character needs a hat. It didn't much matter before then too much what kind of hat they may have had. But then as time went on and you had photographs, people would know, no, that's the wrong kind of hat for that person, for that time period, for that particular play. And even in one particular time period, you might need to create a different kind of hat for each different character. And so just as painters were coming to realize this as well, you would have people in the theater wrestling with similar problems. Now, the picture that I just put up and the different details are Georges Seurat's great painting from the late 19th century, A Saturday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, which of course was the basis or backdrop for the Stephen Sondheim musical Sunday in the Park with George, and really one of the centerpiece and most beloved songs from that is actually called Finishing the Hat. So that attention to detail suddenly became a much greater and more important thing for artists at the end of the 19th century. Well, if you think about like now, our modern director, what is a director like? Directors are so different, the way they approach their work, their temperament, their aesthetics, all the different things that they're going for. So sometimes when I talk about directors, I like to think about similes. A director is like, or is the same as, or similar to. And here are a couple of examples of what I mean. A director is kind of like a coach, someone who's helping someone do a better job in their performance on a sports team or on a stage. A director is like a teacher, someone who has the knowledge and is teaching people how to do it. A director is also like a tour guide, someone who, again, has a lot of knowledge and is leading a group of people and interpreting not only what an object is, but what it means and how it connects to other things. A director is like a god, sort of in charge of the entire world of the play and all the choices within it. A director is like a conductor. The musicians certainly know how to play, but in order to keep them together and to keep the dynamics appropriate so that the ideas and the tones and the different dynamics of the music come through in a more coordinated fashion, you need a conductor. And a director is like a loving parent, watching their child, everyone on the team, or maybe the whole production, if you will, sort of grow up and become its best possible self. A director is like a guru, some sort of mystical swami who has some secret kind of answers that can unlock whatever the problems of the production might be. The director is like a drill sergeant. Well, this one actually is a 4-star general right there. But the person who is telling you to do it again and again and again, to get it right, get it perfect, polish it, make it sharper, tighter, faster, louder, funnier. The director is also like a cheerleader, someone who is there on the sidelines, encouraging people to be better in all aspects of the show. And the director is also a magician, seemingly pulling some miracle out of that hat right there and solving the problems of a production. Well, that's one way that you can look at what a director does. Let's look at it a little more like a job. Usually, if you get a position description, at least ones that I've had in the past, tell you this is what you're supposed to do. And then there might be a page that say, here's the knowledge, skills, and abilities you need to have in order to do this job well. And these are some of them for a director. In the gray, you can see a number of different terms that might relate to sort of the larger visionary and leadership ideas that a director needs to have. In the blue, then, are some of those softer skills, the kind of one-on-one qualities that you need to have to really connect individually with a lot of different people who are coming together for this project of putting on that that particular show. There's also a lot of technical knowledge that you need. Now, you don't have to be the person who's going to design the set or design the costumes and the lights and the sound and everything. But you need to know how to talk with your designers, have a basic understanding of the tools that they have for the trade, and how to communicate with them to get what you want. And in the background, you should have a basic understanding of the sort of scope and history of the other related arts of history, literature, psychology, so that as you dive into a particular show, you know that you're then diving a little bit deeper into those particular elements that are necessary to make that show a success. And then maybe flipping over to the other side of your brain, you need to know how to work a calendar, and you need to know how to work a balance sheet, if you will, so that you can arrive at opening night with a show that is complete and as good as it can be, and that you're coming in on or under budget. So all of the skills that you can bring to bear for planning, organization, and financial management are a great asset for a stage director. I'm going to drive this down just a little bit more, and looking on, we have some of the folks who are wonderful directors in the Twin Cities area. So on the to-do list for directors, you think like, okay, well, how do we go about leading an entire production? Well, let's do an imaginary thing. Let's say it's 1 year before opening. That's the little red parentheticals you see right there. We're just going to say that by way of example. It might be more, it might be less. Let's say you get a gig and you're going to be directing a show and it's 1 year out. Well, then the first thing you're doing is you're reading that script and you're reading it again and you're thinking about it and you're researching it and you're planning on what you want to say with your production. We used to say creating a concept. That's a little bit more of a 1980s kind of term, I think. But it is a little sort of like, what is your take on it? This is the time when you decide, I am going to put this classic comedy in the 1920s. Won't that be fun? Or this Shakespearean tragedy is going to take place in Nazi Germany. By the way, you don't need to do that. It's been done a lot. So once you have a really good, solid, imaginative concept or idea for the show, your take on it that really fires your imagination, then you're going to want to start working with your design team. And you don't need to have everything figured out, because those people are artists too, and they will hear what you have to say, but they will have ideas as well. And then you can work together on that and come up with an even better way of expressing that for this particular production, for this particular audience, at that particular theater. After that usually comes a time when you have to secure your actors, and that could be through an open or invited auditioning kind of process, but you want to get the best possible actor cast in each role in your show, obviously. There comes a time then when you need to start thinking ahead very specifically to what you want to do with that very precious rehearsal time that you have coming up. And that's when you're doing your planning for that, all the same while your designers are probably finishing their design phase and you're approving that, and they are going into their building and their creation time period. Now, your rehearsal process may start, most often starts with a read through, everyone around a table, just reading the play out loud. It's a little bit of an icebreaker kind of thing and give people a sense of like where you're going. You talk about what the production will look like in the end, and then you might spend a few hours, a few days, whatever you have, doing some kind of ensemble building icebreaker or some preliminary kind of tasks. Now, maybe it might be doing some text work for that Shakespeare play. You might need to get people up on their feet to practice that one little dance that occurs in the bar scene at some point, or maybe there's some sword fighting that's going to happen. There may be dialect work, or it could just be other theater games and ensemble building that might be appropriate for your particular show. And for goodness sakes, if you have a 4-week rehearsal process, as I have outlined here, if you are spending a week on that, time to get them up and start moving pretty soon, because the actors will want to get a sense of how to create their physical and emotional characters within the environment of the play. So staging the play or blocking is what happens next. For me, I know where actors are coming and going. I know what the furniture for the living room, let's say, looks like. I know for a tea scene that probably quite a few people are going to be sitting down. If someone is in a dramatic moment, is taking charge of the scene, that person might be down center, or they might be up on a higher level. And so with those ideas in mind, then I like to play around and let the actors explore with me the basic dynamics and physical environment of the space and what that might look like. And then the work might go into scene work in the following week or at the end of that staging week. And that's when the actors, by this time, really understand their characters and are able to go further and further with the relationships, what the scene is about, what the arc of the whole story is going to be. And so together, as you explore all that, hopefully you'll be able to go through all of the material 3 times and then be able to run it a couple of times. That's usually my standard before you hit Tech Week. And Tech Week is when you move into the theater, onto the set, costumes are then added, and you go through a period that seems both slow and pokey and chaotic at the same time. And by that, I mean, it just takes a lot of time to get the finished costumes in place, and certainly to set all of the different light cues and sound cues in a show. But meanwhile, especially if you're acting, there are so many new visuals and practical things that are coming at you in terms of props and costumes, walls and actual staircases and things like that, that it can be overwhelming. And for you as a director, you're trying to help bring everyone through that as successfully as you can, so that you can have 1 or 2 at least clean dress rehearsals before you might hit a preview or 2 or 3, when the actors can perform the show and really own it in front of an audience. And at that point, it's time to open the show. And then your job as a director is largely done. And you turn over with gratitude your production to the theater, to the company of people who are doing it, and particularly to your stage manager, who will then lead the show forward and keep the shape exactly or close to what you had originally intended and rehearsed. So that's kind of the basics of what a director needs to do from a very sort of high perspective. Now you might be thinking, yeah, but how do you get a job as a director? Well, actors can audition, and audition notices are posted, but directing, it happens a little bit different. Here's my story. I worked as an actor for about 10 years at a lot of different Twin Cities theaters, but particularly at one theater in St. Paul called Park Square Theater, where in the late 1980s, Richard Cook, the artistic director, realized, oh, he's probably going to need another regular director or 2 because of people who are moved away and moved on or whatever. And so I thought, this is something that I think I'd like to try to see if it's something that might fit for me. And so the show that I pitched was George Bernard Shaw's Candida. And I chose that because I had played one of the leading roles at another theater just a few years before. So I knew the show really well. It has 1 set. It's 6 actors. It's not overly long. There's some comedy, there's some nice sentiment and ideas. So I thought, like, okay, there are no hard things in it. This might be a good one to start with. So that's really how I pitched it. And it fit with Park Square's programming at the time. So I got the green light and I directed it. It turned out really successfully. I had wonderful actors, and it's an actor-driven piece. And the show got great reviews. It sold really well. And that, of course, led to a couple other offers from Park Square in the next couple years. So I was able to do that. And then I was able to have other people become aware of my work, and then I continued working around at other theaters in this very rich and diverse theater community that we're part of here in the Twin Cities area. I had another friend about that same time period who said, I have an MFA, and so I sent my resume out for directing along with a cover letter to all the theaters in town, and I didn't hear back from anyone. And my inside thought bubble was just like, well, of course not. You can't just do that. People are busy. They don't know you. They don't know your work. No way you're going to get a gig that way. You have to at least follow up with them somehow. And there's a lot of other things that you can do. I have a lot of friends who go around and do informational interviews with directors, artistic directors, or executive directors. Just maybe go out for coffee or meet them at the theater to hear what they have to say about their work, what they're interested in, what they're working on, and what they're planning for in the future. That way they can get to know you and feel if you might be the right fit for them in the future. All of this is just to say there needs to be a lot of networking, relationship building, and frankly, just a lot of that. So it could include going to shows and going to theaters that you like, seeing directors work who you admire, staying around for the opening night reception, going up to people and finding something positive to say about their show, whether you liked it or not. And hopefully, if it's someone whose work you really like, you'll have a lot of things to say, and they'll be glad to hear it. And as soon as you have any kind of show, even if it's just a staged reading somewhere, a one act that you might be doing, whatever it may be, then invite those people that you built those relationships with to come and see your work and say it's really important, and make sure that you set aside a couple complimentary tickets for them. Now, there are some people who think like, aha, the thing I need to do is be a stage manager. They always need stage managers, so I'll do that. And that's my stepping stone to being a director. Don't do that. Stage managers have particular skill sets, and they are much in demand. So if you're good at being a stage manager, people will want you to continue to be a stage manager. Maybe a better route might be is to say, hey, for free or for a very small stipend, I'll be your assistant director, and I can be there and just observe. If it's getting coffee, well, so be it. But it could lead to your involvement in the show in a more substantial kind of way. And that's a great way for people to sort of build their credentials as a director. And again, further relationships. Even now, there are theaters that I like working at where I know if I go and see one of their shows at a particular time of year, I know that they're going to be thinking about next year's season, and they're at the point of making a final decision on shows, and now they need to start looking for directors. So if I'm there at the right time and see their current show and talk to them, then I'm right in front of them as they're thinking about the thing that's on the top of their mind. And frankly, I've gotten some good gigs just by doing that. The other way is, of course, just do it yourself. You must have some friends or must have some colleagues who are equally hungry to make theater, and take a look in your environment. It's just like, how can you do that? How can people get together and put on a show, no matter what kind of work that you have to do, no matter how little or no pay it might be? You've got to start somewhere, and doing it yourself, if you do a really good job and make theater that you're really passionate about, more than likely, there are going to be people who sit up and notice your work. I want to take a moment just to talk about musicals as separate from plays, because as a director of a musical, your job changes a little bit, especially, particularly, you might think that you sort of split in three. There's really a triumvirate of people who are involved in putting on a musical. You as the director are still in charge of the overall project, for the concept, the unity, all the staging, storytelling, the acting, the character relationships and the arc of things like that, as well as the overall sort of tone and look and feel, what you want to say about that particular show. But you're also working with a musical director, who is, of course, the person who's teaching and shaping the vocal performance for the actors who are singing, and for all the instrumental sections and the musicians who are playing for that musical. There is also a choreographer, and obviously that's the person who creates and teaches all of the dances. And those, of course, the music director, the songs and the dances in a musical are the peak points in that particular art form. So if you're just a person, if you're a director who just directs and you don't also choreograph, it's sometimes a little disconcerting because your rehearsal process might always has to start with sitting down with the music director and figuring out so the cast can figure out, okay, well, this is the score and let's work on that. And then then you start working on a lot of the major production numbers and dance elements in the show. So for the first couple days, you might be thinking, well, what am I supposed to do? However, that problem is solved because musicals are such huge events. There are usually lots of people, there's a lot of costumes, there's a lot of set pieces, and there's a lot of coordination. So another simile that we might want to think of for a director of a musical is in part to be something of a traffic cop, to keep all of those things moving forward, and there are lots of them, and they're big and complicated, so that you can arrive successfully at opening night. I want to talk about Annie as an example. Now we're moving into storytelling time period. So all of us as directors might end up directing Annie at some point, and why not? It's a terrific musical, and it's a wonderful story beloved by little girls. So I directed a production of Annie in summer stock of all things, which of course, that means you have a very short time period, and you also are dealing with a lot of kids and a dog right there. Well, that's how it goes. So when I started this particular production, my choreographer, who I think is a wonderful person and has done really good work for me. I love working with her. I'd work with her again. She took all the orphans off and they were going to work on Hard Knock Life, the first orphan number towards the top of the show. So they went off and worked on that. And then they came back and they said, okay, well, let's show Craig what we've got. And so they did their number. This is the final version, not the original one. But those orphans all came out there and they twirled and they kicked and they spun and they smiled at the audience, and they were just as cute as all get up. They turned around and wiggled their little bottoms and stuff like that in a really sort of cutesy kind of fun, nice kind of way. And they did a special big sell button at the end of the number. And I thought, oh dear. So then I told everyone, this is great. You guys were able to learn so much all together, and you already have a number all put together. Now let's think about what's happening at this particular moment. So the kids have all been woken up in the middle of the night by that evil drunk Miss Hannigan, and she's yelled at them, and she's told them that they have to scrub everything so it looks like the top of the Chrysler building. So these kids are sad, they're frustrated, they're angry as can be. And that's what this song is about. That's what the story is going to be. And I think actually I talked to the choreographer a little bit about that right beforehand, before talking to the kids, obviously. And she got it, the choreographer got it right away. So she said, okay, well, we've learned a lot of really new things. Now let's change around some things to make it even better. And all of a sudden those buckets were being slammed down on the floor. Kids were on their hands and knees scrubbing. They were stomping about. They were doing their fists in the air. And we got an appropriate Hard Knock Life. And they were able to use a lot of the language, the dance language that they had learned in the initial run for their Act 2 number, which is a very, very happy one. You're never fully dressed without a smile. So all of those different cutesy moves could be used in that particular way. Whew. Here's another little story. This is on the research or the front end of things, and then how it got applied in a production. I did Elmer Rice's Street Scene a number of years ago for Girl Friday Productions in Minneapolis. Very large cast show that takes place in front of a New York tenement. So meeting with my wonderful scenic designer and costume designer, we did what designers and directors are doing. We took a look at pictures maybe from an original production, other productions, read some reviews on what's going on, delved ourselves into the world of the playwright, his biography, other writings, and of course, did a lot of work around the visuals of that time period and the social history so we could get the show right. We took a look at a lot of documentary streetscapes of New York City at that time period. And we took a look at the artworks and came across a group of artists, the Ashcan School. Edward Hopper might be an example of one. And we used that color palette and the documentary photographs to help inform what the show would look like. So as you see the production photo at the bottom right there, you get a sense of sort of that gritty yet somewhat artistic kind of backdrop for the set. You see a lot of those same colors, but everything is washed out for this lower middle class, working class, not poor tenement, but working class folks. But then I came across a detail in Elmer Rice's biography. He had originally been trained as a painter. And I thought, aha, street scene. That's the equivalent to like a landscape painting, a portrait, or a street scene. He's trying to do a slice of life, a little bit like a moving painting, as it were. So that's exactly how I began and ended each of the 3 acts, with a tableau of characters out there on stage, frozen. And the lights would come up, and so the audience could look at that for a moment or two, and then sort of lean into this time period and absorb all the different people and characters. And then after several seconds of that, the action would start and the play would go forward as normal. And that happened at the end of the act, at the beginning of Act 2, at the end of Act 2, at the beginning of Act 3, and then at the end of the show, at the end of Act 3, to do a variation, because that's what we do in theater, to develop an idea. At that point, as each of these many characters are resolving their story, they decide to do one thing, like you see kind of something of the leading lady heading off in the corner right there with her suitcase. After her last line, she started walking and began walking more and more slowly until she froze in place. The other action was continuing at regular speed until each character in succession was done, and then they'd slowly go into a final pose, and eventually the audience would watch as everything on stage became a street scene picture, and the lights went out, and that was the end of the show. So that's a way that you can take the research that you've done and a detail in a playwright's biography and use it to inform the look and the movement and the style of the show. Here's another example of kind of artistic choices and practical considerations. I had the great honor and opportunity to direct a new version of the Dracula story called Dracula, Prince of Blood by a wonderful man named Scott Dixon for the Commonweal Theater Company located in the small little town of Lanesboro, Minnesota. I've done a number of shows there, and this was really a wonderful opportunity to work on a great story and to work on a new version of that. There were a number of challenges. Of course, if you're doing Dracula, it's a spectacle show, and the resources at Commonweal Theater, although very good for doing that kind of grand spectacle, are somewhat limited. Dracula is also basically a thriller, a story play. What happens next? What happens next? And so you need to move the show forward really, really quickly. But the script was written in many different locations, going back and forth and here and there. So the transitions, I realized, were going to be a real challenge. How can we do that as quickly and as seamlessly as possible so that we don't dilute the tension, but maybe instead with each transition, we amp it up so that the rising action of the show, that sense of eeriness and terror and dread, just keeps escalating. And to make matters even a little more challenging, Dracula was performed in rotating rep with another show, and there was limited backstage space. So we had to come up with a unit set that would satisfy the requirements of our show and then flip around to be used for another show. Well, we were able to do that. And normally, I would say one of the most important things is when you're working on a show, on a new play, you might spend quite a bit of time in development, really wrestling with all of those kind of issues or problems, those challenges and opportunities. But we were limited. And we were limited because Scott had cancer. And in fact, just shortly after the show closed, he passed away. So it was very important that all of us deliver the best possible show, and also being realistic and compassionate about the amount of work that he might be able to do. Fortunately, he was able to do quite a bit of that work. So we had a good script in hand. Here's one of the ways that I was able to hopefully solve or address one of the challenges. In the opening exposition scene of Dracula, the audience suddenly becomes aware that there is a woman walking down the aisle. They think, is that an audience member? But no, she's dressed in a nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's holding a suitcase. She steps up onto the stage while the guys are still talking. They don't seem to see her at all. It's like she's in a dream or a nightmare. A moment later, another person appears on the balcony in silhouette, and we don't know who that is either. The guys finish up their exposition scene, and they exit, still not seeing either of the two people. As they do exit, the lights come up on the woman on the balcony. She's reading from her diary, and we realize that she's talking about Lucy, who climbs another staircase and enters the bedroom area. We realize that the woman on the balcony is Miss Mina, and we're now going into the second scene of the play. It's as if Lucy were just arriving, and at the same time, just awakening from her nightmare. She gets into bed, and shortly after that, scene 2 begins. I used this technique of overlapping scenes throughout the entire show with different variations, so that sometimes the audience would perceive Dracula arriving before he actually entered the scene. This minimized any time needed for scene shifts and kept the audience in a continual state of suspense and dread as the eeriness and the terror continued to mount throughout the show.
You have a spectacular view of the countryside from here.
And here's a third and final story on a particular director choice and challenge that came up. Again, for Girl Friday Productions in Minneapolis, I directed a production of Thornton Wilder's beloved play, Our Town. One of the things that we really wanted to do with this show is, in a sense, maybe rescue it from the productions that some of us may have known in the past, where we thought like, we remember some high school or maybe some subpar community theater production that we may have seen or been a part of at some time. And we wanted to take a look at this marvelous, marvelous, magical, sophisticated play in what it says and how it says it in a new production. We did, of course, follow all of the main trappings of the script and the stage directions in terms of like the look and the period. So there was the usual sort of very stripped down. Here we are in an empty theater. We have the ladders. And so there's George and Emily up on their ladders looking up at the nighttime sky. But I also made an important change. Instead of having the character of the stage manager who narrates the show and tells us what's happening and what it means, I thought, well, the play is called Our Town. So how about instead of having, let's face it, some older white guy tell us all of those things, maybe it's each of the people in the show who are doing that. So I divided up the stage manager's lines among all the other characters. So it wasn't the actors, they were still in character addressing the audience at the beginning of each act in those longer monologues, and all of the other different times when the stage manager nods in, participates in the action, or comments on it. So everyone in the show, including the kids, all had a little bit of that direct address to the audience to do. So for example, at the top of the show, all of the actors are seated in chairs We know what that means. And eventually, after a moment or two, one of the characters gets nudged by the others. And that character is Simon Stimson, probably the person who least wants to tell the story of our town again, who was not happy during his life on Earth. But he gets up and he starts telling us about the town, as you see in the picture at the bottom. And then one by one throughout the show, as I've said, other characters take over and they talk more about our town and about their experience in there. So they're taking ownership of their own story. So for example, at the top of Act 2, the long stage manager monologue is delivered by Howie Newsome, who, if you know the play, he's usually one of the first characters who appears in Acts 1 and 2, since he's the milkman coming along. So he does the monologue and then goes right into delivering the milk and his scene work. The top of Act 3 takes place in the graveyard, and Mrs. Gibbs does that wonderful, heartfelt monologue about life and death and eternity. And she walks around and she's talking about the other people in the graveyard now. And she stops by one of the chairs and she says, "And Mrs. Gibbs." And she sits down in it. And then we realize that the person talking to us is now dead. Finally, at the end of the whole play, after Emily has had the experience that the audience has had of going back and looking at their lives and thinking about how precious life is, it's only at that point that Emily is able to do any of the narration. And so she concludes the play almost as if the day is ending and a new day will begin. And now she's is able to tell the story of our town. And if you take a look at the picture on the bottom, that means that all of the people in Act 3 who were the dead people are sitting on one side of the stage, but the so-called living people are also sitting in chairs. And so they have joined them. So then we as the audience realizes, oh my gosh, they've all been dead and come back to life to share this experience with them. The production, I'm glad to say, it sounds like I'm boasting all this time, but this was probably the best idea I've ever had in theater, and it worked like gangbusters. It got great reviews. It sold really well. People were rapturous about it. And in fact, in one of the online reviews, an absolute rave that the production received was read by the folks at Dramatist Play Service, who licensed the play to us. And they said, "What are you up to there? I hear you've cut the stage manager. That is outside of the licensing for doing the show as written." And we said, "Gulp, we're doing all the lines, we just divided it up." And after a little bit of a tense conversation with the estate, the executors of Thornton Wilder's estate, they said it was okay for us to go ahead and continue with the production. So even though this was a wonderful idea that worked out in our favor, like magic theatrically, I don't recommend you doing that. Sometimes being a director, it's hard to keep just like a full aesthetic and all of these different things, and how to manage each individual moment or challenge that comes up. But along the way, a number of my friends who are directors have said something that I thought like, wow, that really sticks with me. I'm going to try to remember to do that. Peter Rothstein, who's the artistic director at Theater Latte Da in Minneapolis, I heard him say once, "I practice saying, I don't know at every rehearsal so that he knows and that everyone else knows that we're working together and we're creating something and we don't have all of the answers. And it is a journey and eventually we'll make the best possible choice for our production." My kind of joking version of that, if someone says, "Well, when are we going to do this?" instead of saying, "Oops, I don't know, I completely forgot about it," I usually say, "We'll be able to decide that by Thursday." And then almost inevitably, people go away super happy because anyone can wait till Thursday to have it. their problem solved. Another person, John Heimbach from Walking Shadow Theater Company, has the habit of saying to the actors at the end of rehearsal, do you have everything that you need? Do you have what you need? And that idea of always closing with being able to get feedback from people on where they might have felt a little bit of discomfort or where there's something else that's still hanging out there, keeps those communication channels open. And one I really like was something that I heard said by Susie Messerol, and you can see her in the black and white photograph standing next to me where I have more hair, both on my face and on my head. And she said, it's the director's job to care. It's the director's job to care about everything in the show, to care about the play, to care about the audience, to care about the theater company, to care about every prop that goes on stage, all of the costumes, every acting moment. It's the director's job to care. It's not the job of the other people on the show to care about everything. In fact, sometimes it can be kind of a problem if they do, but it's the director's job to care about all aspects of the production. Which kind of leads me to one of my favorite sayings about theater or about directing. It's by William Ball from his book, Notes on Directing. The greater the unity, the greater the art. And I love it because I think he means greater, not only in the sense of everything, the greater the unity, to make sure that all of the pieces are unified together and then you have greater art, but that the unity itself has a greatness to it, that the heart and the mind and the soul of the piece that you're trying to express reaches the biggest possible statement. And it doesn't need to be physically big to do that. But as William Ball says elsewhere in the book, somehow that piece of theater can reveal universe, a completely new world. And so for a really brilliant director like Julie Taymor, could take an animated Disney film, a really good one and a really fun one, and see in it all of the archetypal journeys and stories of growing up and maturing, and to be able to look at it in wonderfully fresh and new theatrical ways to tell a new and bigger story that, just like Peter Brook with A Midsummer Night's Dream, can totally transform how we think of that particular story and how we think about doing theater in the future. And on that note,